excuse me while I have to say this. Back in the old days, 100 years ago, I used to not like to have to turn my head like this. So when there were just a few people there, I had them all glob up in the middle and put a little speaker stand right there, and never mind. When communist forces invaded Vietnam in the 1950s, Hien Pham, like many Vietnamese Christians, was arrested and jailed for his beliefs. After he was released, he made plans to escape from Vietnam. He secretly began building a boat. 53 fellow Vietnamese made plans to escape with him. One day, 4 Viet Cong soldiers came to Pham's house and confronted him. They heard he was planning an escape. Was it true? Of course, Pham lied to them. If he had told the truth, the Viet Cong might have killed him and arrested the other 53 participants. But after the soldiers left, Pham felt uneasy. Did God really want him to lie? Didn't he trust that God would take care of him in all circumstances? So even though it made no logical sense, Pham believed that God wanted him to tell the truth, even at the risk of his own life. So Pham resolved that if the Viet Cong returned, he would confess his escape plans. Very few of us will ever be in the position where following Christ puts us at risk of imprisonment or death. Maybe if we were in that position, our choices would be clear, but they would not be easy. Every day, we are being tested. Do we live according to what we know to be God's will, or do we settle for something less? Mostly even in non-life-threatening situations, we settle. We settle for less than the absolute best. The great novelist Flannery O'Connor wrote these words: "You shall know and do the truth, and the truth will make you odd." If we were to truly live in the most Christian way, would we not look a bit odd in today's world? About 25 years ago, 20,000 middle and high school students were surveyed regarding lying and truth-telling. 92% of the teenagers reported having lied to their parents in the course of the previous year. 73% said they told lies weekly. Obviously, these surveys were anonymous. 91% of all respondents said that they were, quote, satisfied with my own ethics and character. Apparently, living truthfully would make you odd in today's world. The life of faith would be less odd if the life of faith were easier, because then more people would do it. And so it would not be as odd. Hebrews 11 defines faith as being sure of what we hope for and certain of what we do not see. Don't expect much respect from our society if you claim allegiance to a God no one can see, or to promises that will only be fulfilled in the far-off future. Our passage today is about Abraham. Abraham is 75 years old when God first calls on him to leave his home and his extended family and go to a land chosen for him which God will guide him to, but to which he is not given a map at the present time. Personally, I would require a map. When God called Abraham, God also made him a promise. God would make him and his descendants into a great nation. Here's the first place where doubt could have crept in. The laws of biology that God had put into place seemed to work against the promise. Abraham was 75 years old and had no descendants yet. When you look at this, God said, I will make you and your descendants into a great nation. He did not say, if you will fully obey me, I will do this. He said, I will do this. That is called an unconditional covenant. If he said, if you will, I will, that would have been conditional. Unconditionally. 24 years passed, 24 years of Abraham faithfully following God's leading, 24 years of sorrows, joys, peace, turmoil, 24 years of waiting for God to fulfill his promise. A Christian comedian says, I have learned that faith is having the patience to wait, knowing that all things will be done in God's time. I only wish I had one of God's watches. I'm sure Abraham wished he had one of God's sundials so that he could figure out God's timing. When Abraham was 99 years old, God reminded him that he would father a mighty nation. It was laughable at that point. Both he and his wife were well past the age of bearing children. Sounded like a pipe dream. If we were to go through the Bible and we were to make notes of all of God's promises to us, we might be skeptical. We might laugh too. Did God really mean he would never leave us or forsake us, even when we deserve it? Is God's grace really sufficient to meet all our needs according to his riches and glory? Can God really make all things work together for good for those that love him? All things. You can think of some things that you might think are an exception to that. Like the promise to Abraham of his son in his old age, God's promises to us, vast, awesome, beyond our comprehension. For this reason, few who claim to follow Christ really base their lives on God's promises. When we come to a crossroads, we are more likely to choose the path of least resistance, the way of the crowd. We think about what feels good, what looks right to our circle of acquaintances. We perform a secular risk assessment, and we usually depend on the results instead of the known will of God. What does faith look like today? Today, faith might look like a family that decides not to get a new car or the latest smartphone or a bigger house, but instead budget in order to be able to tithe in order to support God's work. The promise, of course, is that they are laying up for themselves treasures in heaven. But you can't see that. Maybe faith today looks like people who take marriage vows seriously. The attitude that I have noticed is, we'll try it. If we don't like it, we can always get a divorce. Here's one that bothers me. Faith might look like a businessman who gets off work at a reasonable hour and makes his family a priority. Bothers me because I didn't always make good decisions about that. Because I had 2 full-time jobs, and a lot of times I put one of those ahead of my family, and my family got neglected. Would I do it differently if I had to go back? I don't know. It felt like a lot of pressure at the time. Anyway, we are missing out if we do not choose the way of faith. I talked about tithing. That is not always a sacrifice in the here and now. Sometimes that works in ways that you don't expect. My own experience has been that I was better off when I did than when I didn't. I don't ask you to buy that. I simply tell you that's the way it was with me. Back to Abraham. Think about the impossibility of the promise. Abraham and Sarah were older than Carolyn and me. Our passage today says, hoping against hope, Abraham believed that he would become the father of many nations. He did not weaken in faith when he considered his own body, which was already as good as dead, for he was about 100 years old, or when he considered the barrenness of Sarah's womb. No distrust made him abandon God and his instructions. Therefore, his faith was reckoned to him as righteousness. Faith is not based on external circumstances that we can see. It's not based on our condition. It's based on the nature of God. Right relationship with God is not based on our performance. It's based on our faith in Jesus Christ. Abraham knew that on paper, when you evaluated the circumstances, his age and condition, Sarah's age and condition, it was unlikely from a realistic point of view that they would have a child. It just didn't look possible. However, he was convinced that God could do what he had promised. Not because of his circumstances, not because of his condition, because of who God was. He trusted God to do what he promised. The questions we should be asking when tempted to doubt and lose faith are these. Is God real? Is God really good? Can God be trusted? Abraham had plenty of opportunities to turn his back on God and to go back home, to go his own way. He had plenty of opportunities to take Sarah and all that they owned and go back to the place where he had the support of extended family. He didn't do it. At almost any point in his journey with God, human risk analysis would have said going home is the right choice. Abraham stuck with God. Abraham's story is powerful, exciting, but why did it matter to the church at Rome, for whom Paul was writing this letter? The Roman church was a mixture of Jews and Gentiles. The Jews still followed the laws of Moses in addition to the commands and precepts of Christ. That caused a serious rift in the Roman church. In his letter to the Roman church, Paul was demonstrating that from the beginning, our acceptance by God has been through faith and not law. The faith that saved Abraham and made him the father of a great nation is the same faith that saves us today through Jesus Christ. When Paul wrote to the church at Corinth, he said, "For the Son of God, Jesus Christ, whom we preached among you, was not yes and no, but in him it is always yes. For all the promises of God find their yes in him." All the promises of God find their yes in Jesus. He is the final fulfillment of the promise to the descendants of Abraham, the Jews, and to all humankind. It is faith in Jesus that saves us. Faith that he walked in our shoes. Faith that he bore the penalty for our sins. Faith that he died and rose to life again. Faith that he intervenes for us in heaven. Faith that he will someday return to claim his own. We never resolved the story of our friend Hen Pham, did we? Pham finished building his boat. He and his friends made the final plans for their daring and dangerous escape. To their horror, the Viet Cong soldiers returned and demanded to know if the escape rumors were true. Hoping against hope, Hen Pham confessed his plans to escape. Imagine his shock when the soldiers said, "Take us with you." That evening, Hen Pham and his 53 friends and 4 Viet Cong soldiers made a daring escape under cover of dark on a homemade boat. They sailed straight into a violent storm. Pham later in his account of the adventure said that they would surely have been lost except for the expert sailing skills of the 4 Viet Cong soldiers. You reckon God knew about that? The escapees landed safely in Thailand, and eventually Pham immigrated to the United States, where he made a new life for himself. Risk assessment, and I'm going to quote, is a structured evaluation of stressors and variables involved in a proposed course of action to determine whether the risk is manageable and in keeping with the potential rewards expected. Risk management is useful in financial management, health care, and other life choices. If we were to base our choices totally on secular risk assessment, would we ever get married? Would we ever have children? Would we ever devote ourselves to the work of the church in time or energy or financial support if we did it all by human secular risk assessment? Hoping against hope, being fully convinced that God is able to do what he promised, as Christians, we do some things that do not make sense to those who have not placed their faith in God. The questions that arise all boil down to one question: do I trust the one who has promised? Am I willing to stake my present circumstances and my eternity on God's promises and the finished work of Jesus Christ. These questions are not abstract and theoretical. The answers determine how we will conduct our lives where the rubber meets the road when we are faced with choices of how we'll spend our time, our energy, and our money. Those are choices we make every day. Choose well. Your choices here and now will have both present and eternal consequences for you and the people you influence. When deciding between your risk assessment and God's known will, you should consider who knows the most and who is smarter, you or God. Choose well. Amen.